What if pleasure was actually the opposite of constant indulgence and excess? The name Epicurus still makes some people imagine endless feasts and careless debauchery. The truth is quieter, and the real Epicurean prescription is shockingly domestic and humane. Epicurus taught that the good life looks like a small table of friends sharing bread. His philosophy is an argument for removing fear, curbing needless desire, and caring for the mind as much as the body. Epicurus was a Greek philosopher who lived on a quiet island in the 3rd century BCE. He founded a school called the Garden, where men and women studied simple living together without pretension or spectacle. His teaching survived centuries of misinterpretation because later writers sometimes caricatured his ideas as licentiousness. In reality, Epicurus cultivated an ethic grounded in observation, friendship, and the elimination of fear. At the heart of Epicurus's thinking is a deceptively simple definition of pleasure that modern readers often miss. He argued that pleasure is the beginning and end of a happy life. But he did not mean indulgence in the way most imagine. Pleasure for Epicurus meant relief, tranquility, and the absence of pain as much as momentary enjoyment. He wanted people to achieve a steady state of contentment rather than chase fleeting excitements that produce long-term cost. To understand Epicurus properly, we must learn the difference between kinetic and katastematic pleasure. Kinetic pleasures are active, like eating when hungry, and they are transient by nature, producing motion and change in the body. Katastematic pleasure is the more important state for Epicurus because it is the stable condition of being free from pain and want. This second kind represents a peaceful equilibrium in which the mind rests and anxiety has been removed. Kinetic pleasures are immediate and they demand more of us as their price. They provide quick satisfaction that often encourages further desire and leads to instability if pursued without measure. Epicurus did not dismiss kinetic pleasures entirely because some are necessary and good when balanced. He insisted that we recognize their temporary character and avoid turning every whim into a life project, which undermines long-term tranquility. Katastematic pleasure is the hidden gem in Epicurean ethics because it prioritizes permanence over novelty. It is the quiet joy of no longer being hungry, homeless, or frightened, and it does not demand constant stimulation to persist. This state is achieved through moderation, mindfulness, and the removal of unnecessary fears that disturb the soul. For Epicurus, the most sustainable pleasure is the one that does not tire us or require compensatory extremes. People often equate Epicureanism with hedonism because of a superficial reading of pleasure as the highest good. This conflation misses how Epicurus carefully distinguished between wise pleasures and ruinous excesses in his moral calculus. He advocated for choosing pleasures that lead to long-term absence of pain and rejecting those that create greater suffering later. Epicurus described many common desires as unnatural or unnecessary and urged restraint as a path to real happiness. History did Epicurus no favors because his critics delighted in painting him as a party philosopher. Political and cultural forces later twisted his school into a symbol of decadence for rhetorical purposes. Yet archaeological and textual evidence points to a community focused on ethics, friendship, and practical well-being rather than unrestrained pleasure. The caricature says more about the priorities of his opponents than about the philosopher himself. Central to Epicurean tranquility is the removal of bodily pain, which he called aponia, and mental disturbance, which he called ataraxia. These twin states form the backbone of his ethical project and define the kind of pleasure worth pursuing. When a person achieves aponia and ataraxia, they experience a durable union of physical ease and mental serenity. Epicurus believed that this combination is more valuable than transitory splendors and is a realistic aim for everyday life. Friendship was perhaps Epicurus's most practical argument for how to secure a happy life in uncertain times. He elevated relationships as essential medicines for anxiety and as stabilizing forces for both material and emotional needs. Epicurus described friends as the necessary bulwark against misfortune because friends share resources, provide counsel, and create emotional safety. The garden community proved that human bonds are not frivolous, but instrumental to achieving a lasting state of pleasure. The garden was more than a picturesque retreat because it functioned as a living experiment in communal ethics and mutual care. Members pooled advice and goods, and they practiced philosophical conversation as a daily ritual. This school avoided hierarchy and ritual in favor of a quiet, democratic practice of thought and friendship. The garden shows how philosophy can be lived collectively rather than merely proclaimed as doctrine. Epicurus dismantled traditional fears about capricious gods by arguing that gods are not concerned with human affairs. His theology removed the unpredictability that led many to live in terror of divine punishment. By making the gods irrelevant to daily tranquility, Epicurus freed people from rituals driven by fear and redirected moral focus toward human flourishing. The result was a secular, human-centered ethic that prioritized lived peace over supernatural appeasement. One of his most famous assertions about death is startling in its simplicity. Death is nothing to us. He reasoned that when we exist, death is absent, and when death exists, we are absent from experience. This philosophical move deflates the dread of non-existence by showing that fearing something that cannot be experienced is irrational. The consequence is practical courage and a lighter approach to living, because anxiety about future annihilation dissolves. Epicurus's natural philosophy was materialist and empirical at a time when mythic explanations dominated public discourse. He embraced early atomism, suggesting that the world consists of small, discrete units moving in a void. This framework encouraged observational thinking and reduced superstition because it answered natural questions without appeal to capricious spirits. The materialist foundation undergirds his ethical project by making pleasure and pain natural phenomena rather than divine rewards or punishments. Living simply was not a moral testing ground for Epicurus, but a pragmatic strategy for achieving stable pleasure. He taught that unnecessary desires generate dependency and anxiety, while simple satisfactions cultivate resilience and contentment. By reducing wants and focusing on essentials, individuals lower the probability of pain and increase the chance of lasting tranquility. For Epicurus, voluntary moderation is a pathway that converts scarcity into sufficiency and transforms life into a tolerable abundance. Epicurus offered a taxonomy of desires that helps decide which longings deserve pursuit and which should be ignored. He identified natural and necessary desires like food and shelter, natural but unnecessary desires like luxury, and empty vain desires like fame. This classification operates as a decision tool for modern life because it clarifies where energy should be invested. Using this taxonomy, one can prioritize health and friendship while rejecting status-seeking impulses that erode peaceful living. In the modern world, Epicurean themes appear in movements like minimalism and slow living that resist consumerist velocity. These contemporary trends echo ancient advice by prioritizing relationships and experiences over relentless accumulation. The modern resonance suggests that Epicurean insight is not antique trivia, but practical wisdom for contemporary problems. When people reduce compulsive consumption, they often report increased mental clarity and enduring satisfaction, confirming Epicurus's basic claims. Applying Epicurean friendship to current loneliness epidemics suggests a deliberate investment in small communities. Building dependable social networks fosters practical help and emotional steadiness during turbulent periods. Creating such communities can be mundane work because it requires time, trust, and reciprocity rather than dramatic gestures. The outcome is a network that reduces anxiety and increases life satisfaction much more effectively than isolated consumption. Epicurean tools are surprisingly relevant to modern mental health strategies because they stress habit change and cognitive reframing. The emphasis on removing needless fears parallels contemporary cognitive behavioral approaches to anxiety. By teaching people to reassess expectations and simplify desires, Epicurean practice can reduce chronic rumination and improve emotional balance. Therapists and coaches can integrate these ancient insights into routines that foster ataraxia and resilience. Epicureanism also offers an implicit critique of modern consumer economics that equates growth with happiness. When pleasure is framed as absence of pain rather than accumulation, endless consumption appears less rational and more compulsive. This critique invites policymakers and citizens to consider welfare measures that reduce insecurity and promote communal safety nets. In doing so, the public cultivates a social environment more conducive to catastematic pleasure and collective well-being. Digital life tests Epicurean ideals because novelty is always available and attention becomes a scarce resource. Social media supplies kinetic pleasures in abundance, but often undermines catastatic tranquility by creating comparison and desire. Epicurean practice suggests limiting exposure to stimuli, curating inputs, and seeking offline relationships for stability. By intentionally managing digital habits, people can reclaim mental space and protect the slow pleasures that sustain life. Practically applying Epicureanism can begin with small daily rituals that reinforce calm over frenzy. A morning practice of simple breakfast, a brief walk, and reading something thoughtful primes the mind for sensible desires. An evening routine of reviewing one good thing and removing troubling anticipations prepares the mind for rest and reduces needless worry. These modest actions compound over time and create durable conditions for a peaceful life. No philosophy is a perfect tool for every human situation, and Epicureanism has limitations when facing large-scale injustice or required sacrifice. Its focus on individual tranquility can appear inadequate when systemic action is necessary for collective liberation. However, Epicurean restraint and community building can coexist with political engagement by providing emotional resources for sustained activism. The philosophy is adaptable and can inform both private well-being and public responsibility when applied judiciously. Across 2,000 years, Epicurean ideas keep resurfacing because they address practical human problems with psychological clarity. Their survival suggests that the search for stable pleasure is a perennial human concern across cultures and epochs. The revival of Epicurean thinking in modern wellness culture is not mere nostalgia, but a recognition that ancient wisdom can help navigate contemporary complexity. When applied thoughtfully, its core prescriptions improve personal lives and strengthen communities. The philosophical twist is that Epicurean pleasure is not a selfish end but a social virtue in disguise. By cultivating inner peace and dependable friendships, individuals create conditions that benefit collective life as well as personal well-being. In other words, the quiet pursuit of simple pleasures produces public goods like stability, trust, and generosity. The ethics of pleasure becomes a politics of human flourishing when scaled through communities and institutions. If you take only one lesson from Epicurus, let it be this: seek the absence of pain and the company of good friends. That modest counsel reframes many modern anxieties and points toward durable happiness rather than transient thrills. Epicureanism asks us to measure pleasures by their long-term effects and to invest in life patterns that foster calm and connection. This is not a call to austerity, but to wise, humane moderation that respects both body and mind. To practice Epicureanism this week, try a simple experiment with your desires and social time. Reduce one unnecessary purchase, schedule a conversation with a friend, and reflect nightly on what brought you genuine calm. These small measures will reveal the difference between kinetic thrills and catastematic peace over time. The experiment is practical evidence that Epicurean wisdom is not abstract philosophy, but actionable guidance for a better life. Some critics argue Epicureanism is too inward-looking and neglects the moral energies required for social justice. That objection has merit when Epicurean practice becomes isolationist or indifferent to broader suffering. Yet Epicurean ethics also creates the psychological bandwidth needed for sustained altruism by reducing burnout and fear. Properly read, Epicurus supplies a foundation for kind, patient engagement, rather than a retreat from responsibility. Epicureanism invites a radical reorientation of priorities that remains surprisingly modern because it values tranquility over spectacle. In a world of constant novelty and noise, its counsel to simplify and befriend is quietly revolutionary. This philosophy does not promise utopia, but it offers tools to reduce suffering and increase meaningful pleasure. By adopting modest desires and cultivating honest friendships, we access a durable kind of happiness that withstands uncertainty. The final thought is philosophical and slightly subversive. Pleasure understood as freedom from pain is a profoundly democratic ideal. It suggests that good lives depend less on rare luxuries and more on stable, accessible conditions for most people. If society reorganized to secure basic needs and foster community ties, the aggregate of simple pleasures would likely exceed the benefits of unequal abundance. Epicureanism quietly proposes a politics of sufficiency that respects human dignity across economic categories. If this video gave you a new perspective on pleasure, consider trying one small Epicurean practice today. Share a simple meal with someone you trust, reduce one buying impulse, or reflect on what truly calms your mind. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and join our exploration of ideas that change how we live. Thank you for watching and for choosing thoughtfulness.